My name is Claire, and I'm 48 years old. Life has been a journey of ups and downs, and I had been married to Daniel for over 2 decades. Daniel, my husband, was a good man, successful, hardworking, and kind-hearted, but he was always so absorbed in his career. We lived a comfortable life, but our relationship lacked the warmth that I had once hoped for Simon. My stepson was 25 when I first met him. He was just finishing college at the time, tall and athletic, yet he always seemed distant, like he was carrying some unspoken weight on his shoulders. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out to him to understand the young man he had become. But the gap between us always seemed so vast one summer when Daniel was caught up in yet another business trip. I found myself alone with Simon. He was on break from his job, and after some encouragement, we decided to take a short vacation together. Just the two of us. I had always dreamed of visiting the coast, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away from the noise of everyday life. Daniel's absence allowed for some quiet, uninterrupted time, and perhaps this would give us a chance to connect more deeply. We booked a hotel by the beach. It was small but charming, with the sound of waves crashing against the shore filling the air. The first few days, things felt awkward. Simon wasn't used to spending so much one-on-one time with me. I could tell. He felt the tension between us, this strange, invisible barrier that neither of us knew how to break. But slowly things began to shift. We spent our days by the pool swimming and playing volleyball with other hotel guests. Despite my age, I was always the first to jump into the water, laughing at how carefree and young it made me feel. But one evening, as we were leaving the pool, I twisted my ankle on the uneven pavement, a sharp pain shooting up my leg. Simon, who had been watching from a distance, was by my side in an instant. His hands were gentle as he helped me back to the hotel room, and I was surprised by how attentive he was. He carefully examined my foot, making sure I was comfortable. There was a quiet tenderness in his actions that I hadn't expected from someone so young. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, though. The pain was still there, and I couldn't help but notice how different Simon seemed. Now it was as though the distance between us had begun to close. Something about that shared moment of vulnerability, of him taking care of me, made the walls we had built around ourselves slowly crumble that night. After I had taken some medication for the pain, we sat on the balcony, the moonlight shimmering over the sea. The conversation flowed easier than it ever had before Simon opened up about his life, his dreams, his frustrations, and the pressure he felt to live up to his father's expectations. He had always felt like he needed to prove himself, but he didn't know how. For the first time, I shared my own struggles about the loneliness I felt in my marriage, and how often I wondered if I was truly living the life I wanted. There was a raw honesty between us now, and it felt liberating. I realized that in some ways, we were both trying to find our place in a world that had changed around us over the next few days. Our connection deepened. We spent more time together, not just by the pool, but hiking through the nearby trails, talking about everything and nothing. We laughed until our sides hurt, and even though my ankle was still sore, I found myself enjoying the adventure with him in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was a curiosity between us, now something unspoken, yet undeniable. One evening, after a long day at the beach, we sat in the hotel lounge, nursing cold drinks. I looked over at Simon, who was watching the sunset. Through the glass doors, There was something in the way he was staring at the horizon, something distant and searching that made my heart ache. "Simon," I said softly, "do you ever wonder what life would be like if you didn't have to carry all that weight?" He turned to look at me, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The emotional tension between us was thick, but neither of us moved in. Instead, we simply sat in that space, filled with the quiet hum of the world around us. "I don't know what else I'd do," he admitted. I guess I never really thought about it." The silence stretched between us before I finally broke it. "Maybe it's time to think about it," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Time to think about what you really want." It was then that I realized something. Over the course of our time together, I had come to care for him in a way that went beyond the boundaries of a mother-son relationship. The affection I felt was tender, yes, but also intense, and there was a growing part of me that didn't know how to handle it that night. As we lay in our separate beds in the hotel room, the thoughts swelled around me. Was this just a fleeting connection, a product of the intimacy we had, shared during our trip, or was there something deeper, something more, that neither of us was fully ready to admit? The next morning I found it hard to face him. The tension in the air was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of the unspoken words between us when Simon came into the kitchen preparing breakfast, as we had done many times before he caught my eye. His gaze held something both cautious and curious. "I'm sorry if I made things weird," he said quietly, his voice soft. I've never felt so close to anyone before," I smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "It's not weird, Simon. It's just complicated." I couldn't explain the turmoil in my chest, nor could I voice the feelings I was still trying to understand. Later, when Daniel came to join us for the last leg of our vacation, everything shifted back to normal. At least on the surface, Daniel's presence brought back the distance that once existed between me and Simon. But in the quiet moments, I could still feel the bond we had built. The tension that simmered just below the surface. We returned home and life resumed its pace. I kept my feelings for Simon buried deep within me, unsure of what to make of them. But the vacation had changed me. It had shown me the complexities of love and connection, the vulnerability that can come with stepping outside of what's familiar, though I may never fully understand what happened between us. I do know one thing. That trip and everything that unfolded helped me realize the depth of my own heart and the courage to face what I truly wanted from life. I still think about those days sometimes. The way we laughed, the way we looked at each other, the way the world felt like it had just paused for a moment to let us be. It was a love that wasn't meant to be spoken out loud, but it shaped me in ways that words could never fully capture days past. Since we returned from the beach, but the sense of unanaz between Simon and me lingered. Our interactions were on the surface perfectly normal, polite, casual, and yet neither of us could shake the memory of what had transpired on that trip. That quiet tenderness, the shared vulnerability, the way the world seemed to slow down when we were together, all felt like an impossible dream. A dream that couldn't possibly continue in the real world. Simon had been distant since we came back, and so had I. I wanted to give him space, to let him process whatever it was that had happened between us. But part of me couldn't help but wonder, was I the only one feeling this? Was I just imagining things a week after our return? I found myself thinking about that trip more and more. Every time I saw Simon, I wondered if he could sense the same pull. I felt a magnetic connection that was both unfamiliar and undeniable. And then there were those little moments when our eyes met across the room, or when our hands brushed while passing each other a glass of water. Each touch seemed to hold so much more weight than it should have. Each fleeting moment, laden with unspoken words, carried a tension I couldn't ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon when Simon finally broke the silence. I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, my back to the doorway, when I heard his voice. It was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he had been wrestling with something for days. CLA, he said softly. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I turned to face him. I've been thinking, he continued, hesitating for a second, about everything, about the trip and how things felt between us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My hands, which had been chopping vegetables, suddenly felt too clammy to hold the knife. What do you mean, Simon? I managed to ask, though my voice was barely above a whisper. He stepped closer to me, his gaze steady. I don't know exactly, but something changed when we were together. I'm not sure if you felt it too, but I can't stop thinking about it. A shiver ran down my spine, my breath caught in my throat as his words echoed in my mind. Did he feel it too? My mind raced, wondering how much he knew, or if he had the same strange, conflicted feelings that I did. I had always thought that maybe I was just projecting my own loneliness onto him, but his confession left me questioning everything. I don't know what to say, I murmured. Stepping back slightly, I needed space-time to think, to process, but my mind was in turmoil. Could we talk about this? Should we? Simon looked at me as if waiting for me to say something. His expression was a mixture of longing and uncertainty, and I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, something rare and honest, something I hadn't seen before. It made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable, he said quietly, stepping back as if he regretted saying anything at all. No, it's not that, I replied, my voice trembling. I felt my heart beating faster as I tried to compose myself. Just complicated, Simon. You and I were in different places in our lives, and I married this what we felt. It's not something that can be acted on. I saw his shoulders sag slightly, the weight of my words sinking in. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the knife tapping, the cutting board. The tension in the air was palpable. My chest tightened, and I fought to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. But Simon didn't turn me away. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I know, he said softly, his voice quieter than before. I didn't expect anything, I just needed to say it. I nodded, trying to find the right words, but everything felt too big, too tangled to unravel in one conversation. Instead, I stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. Almost instinctively, it was as if I needed to ground myself in the moment, to remind myself that we could still be normal despite everything swirling beneath the surface. I'm glad you said it, I whispered, my fingers brushing lightly against his skin. We stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking, both of us lost in thought. Finally, Simon spoke again, I think. We both need some time, he said, breaking the silence. Time to figure out what we want and what we feel. No more pressure. I nodded again, my heart heavy with a mixture of relief and regret. As much as I had wanted to explore this connection, I knew he was right. Time would help. Maybe it would make things clearer. Maybe it would make the space between us feel more manageable. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine. I kept my distance, as did Simon, but every now and then paths would cross in the hallway or at the dinner table, and there was always that lingering look, a brief flicker of recognition between us. Neither of us spoke about it again, but I could feel the quiet tension simmering beneath the surface, as if we were both waiting for the other to make the next move. Then one night, a twist came. Daniel had a last-minute business trip, leaving me alone with Simon. Again, the house was unusually quiet, and the air felt thick with the same unspoken words that had haunted us for weeks. Simon had been quieter than usual, and I could tell that he was struggling with something. "I've been thinking," he said that evening, his voice hesitant. Maybe we should talk about this. Really talking about it." I looked at him, unsure how to respond. The idea of confronting our feelings was both terrifying and exhilarating. My heart raced at the thought of what might come next, but I knew that we couldn't keep avoiding the truth. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice tight. Simon nodded, his expression determined. "I think it's the only way to move forward. We can't keep pretending like nothing happened." I exhaled slowly. The weight of his words sinking in there was no turning back. "Now, all right," I said softly, my heart pounding Leighton talk. That night, after weeks of avoidance, Simon and I finally sat down together. The weight in the air felt suffocating, as though the walls around us had been closing in, pushing us toward this inevitable moment. We had avoided talking about what had been simmering between us for so long. But now it seemed unavoidable. I could feel my pulse quicken with a mix of fear and anticipation. As I waited for Simon to speak, he cleared his throat, glancing at me nervously. "CLA," he began, his voice low but steady. "I need to know what's going on with us. I don't think I can keep pretending like things are just normal anymore. We can't go on like this." My stomach churned at his words, but I knew he was right. The tension between us had grown unbearable. The subtle glances, the brief touches, everything had been building up to this conversation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I don't know what's happening, Simon," I admit, Ed quietly. My eyes not meeting his. I don't know what to do with how I'm feeling. This thing between us, whatever it is, it's not something I planned for. It's not something that's supposed to happen. He was silent for a moment, and I could tell that he was pressing my words. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but I don't want to keep pretending that nothing's changed. I can't just ignore what I feel, what we've shared." I looked up at him, then meeting his gaze. The intensity of his words settled deep in my chest. There was no easy answer to this. There were so many things to consider, so many layers of complexity that couldn't be untangled with a few simple words. "I know," I whispered, my heart aching, "but there's more at play here than just what we feel, Simon. There's my marriage, there's your relationship with your father, there's everything. If we cross that line, it's not something we can take back for a long time." We sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in, and then, as if something inside him broke, Simon let out a quiet sigh and leaned back in his chair. "You're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's too complicated. Maybe we're better off just leaving things as they are." But just as I was about to respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted us. Startled, we both turned toward the sound. I got up puzzled and opened it only to find Daniel standing there. His face was unusually pale and his eyes were wide, with something I couldn't quite place Claire. "Daniel," said his voice, strained, "there's something I need to tell you." Something about Simon. A cold chill washed over me. My mind raced the dread, creeping up my spine. What could he possibly mean? I glanced at Simon, whose face had gone completely white. It was as if the colour had drained from him in an instant. He didn't speak, only stared at his father, his lips pressed tightly together. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Daniel stepped inside, looking around the room as though he wasn't sure where to begin. "This is going to sound impossible," he began, "but I need you both to hear me out. The truth is, I didn't want to tell you this, but it's time, Simon. You need to know now." Growing more confused, Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking between us. "Simon, you're not my son." The words hung in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted, as if everything I thought I knew about my life had suddenly turned upside down. Simon stood up abruptly, his face filled with disbelief. "What do you mean? I'm not your son." His voice cracked with emotion. Daniel's eyes were filled with a strange mix of regret and sorrow. "Simon," he said, "wasn't honest with you before. I wasn't your biological father when I married your mother. I made the choice to raise you as my own, but your real father, the man who gave you life, is someone else." There was a long silence as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath us, and nothing felt certain anymore. My heart raced as I processed what Daniel had just revealed. Simon, clearly in shock, took a step back, his eyes wide, with confusion. "But how? Why didn't you tell me?" his voice shook, and I could see the pain in his eyes. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with his own emotions. "I didn't know how. I never wanted you to feel like you weren't my son, but it was something that needed to be said, especially now." I stood there frozen, trying to understand what was happening. My mind struggled to piece everything together, but nothing seemed to make sense. And then the most unbelievable thought occurred to me, the thing that none of us could have possibly expected. What if I began my voice trembling? What if this is why we felt the way we did? What if all along we were never meant to be stepmother and stepson? What if we were something else, something connected in a way we never knew? Simon's eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of understanding passed between us. My heart raced again, not with confusion, but with something I couldn't name. It was as if the story that had begun in such a tangled, impossible way had finally revealed its unexpected twist. Daniel, seeing the shock on both our faces, stepped forward. "I know this changes everything," he said, "but we'll figure it out. We'll find a way to make sense of it." And in that moment, I realized something that took me completely by surprise. This wasn't a story of forbidden love. This wasn't about boundaries that couldn't be crossed. It was about discovery. It was about understanding that sometimes life doesn't unfold in the ways we expect, that the connections we make with others, whether they are family, friends, or even strangers, are more complex than we realize. As the night stretched on, we sat together in silence for a while, each of us processing this revelation. But something had shifted, something fundamental. The questions, the confusion, the strange bond between Simon and me, all of it had changed shape. We were no longer just a woman and her stepson caught in a web of emotions neither could understand. We were two people, connected by something deeper, something hidden, finally revealed. And though we didn't know what the future would bring or how this new reality would unfold, there was one thing I was certain of: our journey had only just begun.